The committee will come to order. Welcome all to this very important hearing on the difficult fiscal challenges and economic challenges ahead of us. I want to welcome CBO Director back with us again and with his beautiful daughters. It's good to have you here again, Doug. I wish we had better news. I want to thank Doug, first of all, Dr. Elmendorf, and your entire CBO staff for their hard work on the release of the annual budget and economic outlook. We have a compressed timeline this year, given the tardiness of the President's budget, given our Easter coming earlier, so we know that CBO is going to be pushed extra hard this year, and I know you're working really hard around the clock over there. So I first off want to start off by saying thank you for all you've done. There's no question about it. Our fiscal and economic outlook is grim. According to CBO's outlook, 2012 will mark the fourth straight year of trillion-dollar deficits. Trillions more dollars will be added to the debt in the years ahead, putting a chilling effect on job creation today and committing the next generation to a diminished future. CBO projects economic growth to remain sluggish and the unemployment rate to hover near 9% through 2014. This report confirms what too many Americans already painfully are aware of. President Obama's economic policies simply are not working. The President and his party's leaders successfully enacted much of their agenda, but they have failed to advance policies that get our economy growing. They have failed to advance solutions that get our fiscal house in order. In the Senate, they have failed to pass a budget in over 1,000 days. The problems have been growing for years, and there is no question that the blame is bipartisan in nature. For years, politicians from both political parties have failed to be honest with the American people about the size and scope of this debt threat. The new House majority has worked to chart a new course. In this committee, we authored and advanced a principled reform agenda that provides a brighter fiscal and economic outlook. The House-passed budget strengthens our critical health and retirement security programs. It repairs our fraying safety net, and it makes sensible reforms that spur job creation and economic growth while putting government spending on a more sustainable path. In response to our budget, the President and his party leaders have still yet to put forward a credible plan to solve our country's problems. Look, we have a big difference of opinion on the big questions of the day, but I hope CBO's alarming report encourages us to focus on the urgent need for real solutions instead of resorting to the same old false attacks with no alternatives. Let's build upon the sensible spending cuts enacted last year on a bipartisan basis. Here at the House Budget Committee, we've worked in a bipartisan manner to advance budget reforms aimed at reducing the deficit and improving accountability. There are ongoing efforts to build a bipartisan coalition on the critical need to save and strengthen Medicare, for example. I invite the President and my friends across the aisle to join us in this conversation. The CBO's outlook could not be more ominous. I look forward to your testimony, Dr. Elmendorf, which I hope can inform and guide this committee as we work to advance solutions in the year ahead. And with that, I'll yield to the Ranking Member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the Chairman in welcoming you, Dr. Elmendorf, and your two daughters. It's great to have members of the family here today. And I want to reference the report that was issued by CBO yesterday, the Chairman mentioned, because while it shows that the economy remains very fragile, it also shows that it is slowly recovering. It demonstrates that we still have much work to do to create jobs, tackle the deficit, and return the budget to a long-term, fiscally sustainable path. But for a moment, let's focus on the positive signs of the budding economic recovery and remember where we were just 3 years ago. If you could please put up the slide. The first slide, this slide right here. What this slide shows is that when the day that President Bush left office, the day that President Obama was sworn in, the economy was collapsing at an even faster rate than originally thought. The gross domestic product was plummeting at a rate of 8.9%. In other words, negative 8.9% GDP. and we are shedding more than 840,000 jobs a month. So in the month the President was sworn in, 840,000 jobs were lost. As shown in previous CBO reports and findings, the passage of the Recovery Act, coupled with actions to save the auto industry and efforts by the Federal Reserve, helped end the free fall and began the climb upward toward economic growth. Now, we've all heard the expression that we're entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. The fact is that the CBO said that the Recovery Act helped save or create up to 3 million jobs in the year 2010, that it lowered the unemployment rate by up to 1.8 percentage points in calendar year 2010, and lowered unemployment by up to 1.4 percentage points in 2011, compared to what it would have been done if the Congress had not taken action. The private sector has now added jobs in every month since March 2010, adding 3.2 million jobs in total. More jobs were created last year than in any year since 2005. And what this chart shows very plainly is that we are on a huge downhill cascade, and that after the President was sworn in, we began to reduce the downward momentum, turn the corner, and have been steadily heading up, reducing first the rate of job loss, which you obviously have to do when you're losing GDP at an 8.9% rate, and headed into positive job territory. So the facts as reported by the CBO are clear that the Recovery Act did serve its purpose. It's kind of like when you're walking up an escalator that's going down very quickly. If you take no action, you will go down very fast. Even if you take action, it will appear at first that you're running in place, and then slowly you'll be moving up. And that's what we're doing. The CBO report, of course, also shows that the economy remains fragile and that we still face serious budget obstacles. While the economy continues to grow, at the current rate, it will take too long for unemployment to return to the pre-crisis levels, which is why our first priority has to be making sure we do what we can to help small businesses and businesses help put people back to work. We should take immediate action in this House on the plan the President submitted to the Congress last September, the President's jobs plan, including his significant infrastructure investments to help rebuild our infrastructure around the country. We should finish the job with respect to extending the payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans and making sure that unemployment insurance is there for people who have lost work through no fault of their own. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to apologize to both you and Dr. Elmendorf, because after the statement I'm going to have to go to the conference committee on that issue, and I hope that conference committee will move forward quickly and without delay to get that job done. Finally, the Congressional Budget Office's report underscores the need to address the looming deficit in a balanced, reasoned way. The Budget Control Act that this body passed last year and the President signed saves about $1 trillion from cuts in the discretionary budget over the next decade. It will also result in an additional $1 trillion in deficit reductions starting in January 2013. There are better ways to do that, and there are worse ways to do that. I hope this Congress will come together and do it in a way that makes sense. But I think as we listen to the testimony from Dr. Elmendorf, it will be clear that the bipartisan commissions that have looked at this challenge were right. Simpson-Bowles, Rill and Domenici, that you really need to tackle this in a balanced way. And I'm just going to quickly put up two charts, and then I'll conclude the opening statement. What this chart shows, and I believe, Dr. Elmendorf, it's in your testimony, is that under current law, the deficit would be reduced to that bottom heavily blue shaded line, so that over the 10-year period, the deficit would decline substantially if we packed our bags and went away and didn't come back to next year. It would reduce the deficit significantly. Now, that very lightly shaded blue right over the bottom bar is the revenue that is lost if we keep in place all the current tax policies. And so clearly that is a factor. Now, I don't think anyone is suggesting that we want to put in policies that would capture all that revenue. I'm not suggesting that, but this is an important chart to understand what current law would do and the impact of revenue. If we go to the next chart, it quantifies those numbers and makes it clear that if you extend all the 2001-2003 tax cuts and index AMT, that adds 4.5. It should 4.5 trillion to the deficit, and the other extenders, tax extenders, if you continue those, it adds 839 billion. If you add the debt service on that, you get to over $6.3 trillion in revenue. And if you look at the CBO baseline deficits, cumulative over 10 years, they're just over $3 trillion. So the costs of continuing all those policies on the revenue side leads to a doubling of the deficit over the next 10 years. So I want to make it clear. I am not proposing that we change all the current policies. But I think this does give us a very clear indication of the order of magnitude. Well, I'll give a very clear example. $1 trillion of that is accounted for by the tax cuts for the folks at the very top, and if you returned those tax rates to where they were during the Clinton administration, a period of great economic growth, that would be $1 trillion of that. I think we need to tackle this through tax reform, closing loopholes, sensible tax reform. But I do think this underscores what the bipartisan groups have said, that you need to take a balanced approach. Yes, we need to make some cuts. We need to make some reforms. But we also need to deal with the other side of the equation as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for having to leave.
Sure, my pleasure. Dr. Elmendorf, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Van Hollen, and thank you for your kind words about CBO. I am privileged to be leading a group of extraordinarily talented and dedicated public servants, and we all appreciate very much the support that you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Congressman Van Hollen, have shown for our work. We will continue to do our very best for this committee and for the Congress as a whole. I'll be referring as I talk to some charts that I'm told are in your notebooks. It's about half a dozen slides. They're mostly out of the Outlook, but they're collected in this little handout that make it easier for you to follow what I say. Let me begin by noting that our baseline economic and budgetary projections are conditioned on current law, not because we expect that there will be no changes in law, but because this approach provides a benchmark against which potential changes can be measured. What we are presenting is a benchmark, not a forecast. That distinction has a large impact on the budget and economic projections. What is our assessment of the economic outlook? As you know, the pace of the recovery has been slow since the recession ended 2.5 years ago. And we project that it will continue to be slow for the next 2 years, reflecting both the lingering effects of the crisis in the financial markets and the recession, and the fiscal restraint that will arise under current law. Specifically, current law fiscal policy will reduce the growth of output slightly in 2012 and significantly in 2013 through a combination of large tax increases and spending cuts. Our projections incorporate the upcoming expiration of the payroll tax cut and emergency unemployment benefits, the expiration of the tax cuts enacted in 2001, 2003, and 2009, as well as other expiring tax provisions, the constraints on spending imposed by last year's Budget Control Act, and the winding down of the budgetary effects of the 2009 Recovery Act. Taken together, those policies will generate a sharp fiscal contraction. In addition, the excess number of houses, loss of wealth, run-up in debt, and other legacies of the economic downturn are continuing to weigh on household and business spending. You look at the first slide in the packet, which looks roughly like this. We project that real GDP will grow by only 2% this year and only about 1% next year. We expect economic activity to quicken after 2013, but real GDP to remain below the economy's potential through 2017. According to our projections, the economy is only about halfway through the cumulative shortfall in output that will result from the recession and its aftermath. This picture is not the one to which I'm referring at the moment. The costs associated with that persistent output gap are immense, and they fall disproportionately on people who lose their jobs, who are displaced from their homes, or who own businesses that fail. In particular, the labor market still has a great deal of slack, mainly as a consequence of continued weakness in demand for goods and services. In CBO's forecast, the unemployment rate remains above 8% both this year and next. As economic growth picks up after 2013, the unemployment rate will gradually decline. But in our projection, it remains above 7% until 2015, before dropping to 5.25% by the end of the coming decade. While the economy continues to be weak during the next few years, inflation and interest rates will remain low. Let me turn now to our budget projections. Under current law, we expect that this year's deficit will be about $1.1 trillion. At 7% of GDP, that is nearly 2 percentage points less than the deficit recorded last year, but still larger than any deficit between 1947 and 2008. Over the next few years, projected deficits in CBO's baseline narrow sharply, averaging 1.5% of GDP and totaling about $3 trillion between 2013 and 2022. With deficits small relative to the size of the economy, debt held by the public drops a little as a share of GDP, but remains quite high. Much of the projected decline in the deficit occurs because, under current law, revenues will rise considerably. In particular, between 2012 and 2014, revenues in our baseline shoot up by more than 30% because of the recent or scheduled expiration of various tax provisions and new taxes and other collections that are scheduled to go into effect. Federal spending in the baseline declines modestly relative to GDP in the next few years as the economy expands and the statutory caps constrain discretionary appropriations. Later in the decade, spending turns up again relative to GDP because of increasing expenses generated by the aging of the population and rising costs for health care, and because the accumulation of debt and rising interest rates will cause a surge in the government's interest costs. Of course, these baseline projections are heavily influenced by the changes in tax and spending policies that are embodied in current law, changes that in some cases represent a significant departure from recent policies. To illustrate the budgetary consequences of maintaining some tax and spending policies that have recently been in effect, CBO developed projections under an alternative fiscal scenario. Like the baseline, this is not a prediction by us about policy or a recommendation about policy. It's simply meant to show to you the consequences of some fiscal actions that are regularly discussed in the Congress. This alternative scenario incorporates the following assumptions. First, that all expiring tax provisions other than the payroll tax reduction are extended. Second, that the alternative minimum tax, or AMT, is indexed for inflation after 2011. Third, the Medicare's payment rates for physician services are held constant at their current level, rather than dropping by 27% in March and more thereafter, as scheduled under current law. And fourth, that the automatic spending reductions required by the Budget Control Act, in the absence of legislation reported by the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, do not take effect, although in this scenario the original caps on discretionary appropriations would remain in place. Under that alternative fiscal scenario, deficits over the 2013-2022 period would be far higher than in the baseline, averaging 5.5% of GDP rather than 1.5%, and totaling $11 trillion rather than roughly $3 trillion. Debt held by the public would climb on an unsustainable path, reaching 94% of GDP in 2022, the highest figure since just after World War II. Under that scenario, the economy would be noticeably stronger during the next few years than under current law, but noticeably weaker later in the decade. The report presents estimates of those effects, using ranges of numbers to reflect the uncertainty involved. The midpoints of the ranges for the end of 2013 show GNP that is 2% higher and an unemployment rate that is 1 percentage point lower than would be the case under current law. However, the midpoint of the range for 2022 shows GNP that is almost 2.5% lower than under current law because of the crowding out of investment that would be caused by the escalating debt. It bears emphasis that projecting economic outcomes for any path of fiscal policy and the budget outcomes that would result from them is very difficult. Many things could turn out to cause the economy and the budget be worse or better than we project. However, there is no plausible economic outcome under which the policies of the alternative scenario I've outlined would lead to a sustainable budget outcome. The fundamental fiscal challenge during this decade and beyond remains the aging of the population and rising costs for health care. The number of people aged 65 or older will increase by 1/3 in the coming decade, substantially raising the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. In addition, the Affordable Care Act will significantly increase the number of non-elderly people receiving assistance through federal health care programs. Furthermore, CBO predicts that the costs per enrollee for Social Security and the major health care programs will continue to rise. Because of these forces, the set of budget policies that were in effect in the past cannot be maintained in the future. Here's one way to think about the problem, using CBO's projections under the alternative fiscal scenario, which, as I've said, represents a combination of many recent and current policies. Under this scenario, outlays for Social Security and the health care programs would be much higher by the end of this coming decade than in the past, more than 5% of GDP higher than in that 40-year average. However, outlays for all other federal programs are projected to be much lower than in the past, averaging, in the past 40 years, they've averaged about 11% of GDP. In our projections for this scenario, they would be about 8% of GDP in 2022. That would be lower than any year in the past 40 years. But despite the constraint on those programs, the rising costs for Social Security and the federal health care programs mean that the budget deficit under this scenario is projected to be 6.1% of GDP. To keep debt from rising relative to GDP, the deficit would need to be about $900 billion smaller in 2022, in that year alone, than would be the case under this scenario. Therefore, to put the federal budget on a sustainable path, policymakers will need to allow federal revenues to increase to a much higher percentage of GDP than we've seen in the past 40 years, or make very large changes to Social Security and federal health care programs, or pursue some combination of those two approaches. Let me close by highlighting the consequential choices that policymakers face this year. On one hand, if policymakers leave current laws unchanged, the federal debt will probably recede slowly relative to the size of the economy. That will occur because of a large increase in revenues and a sharp restraint in federal spending apart from the largest programs I've mentioned. However, both of those budgetary changes from historical patterns will have significant economic and social effects. Moreover, the sharp fiscal restraint will markedly slow the economic recovery. On the other hand, changing current laws to allow current policies to continue would boost the economy and allow people to pay less in taxes and benefit more from government programs in the next few years, but would put the nation on a quickly unsustainable fiscal course. If policymakers wanted to achieve both a short-term economic boost and medium-term and long-term fiscal sustainability, they would need to enact policies that lead deficits significantly wider than in our current law baseline for the next few years, but significantly narrower than would occur under this continuation of current policies that we've described in the alternative fiscal scenario. In conclusion, how much and how quickly the budget deficit declines over the coming decade will depend in part on how well the economy does. Probably more critical, though, will be the choices you make as you face the substantial changes to tax and spending policies that are slated to take effect within this year. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
So in other words, it's pretty bleak. If I had to sum it up. There are so many areas I could go. Let's talk about Medicare and your analytical tools in measuring what is going to become the largest federal program. We have two scenarios here which do a service of showing, where we're headed. Extended baseline, alternative fiscal scenario. Under the alternative fiscal scenario, which is your attempt to try and get closer to reality, that's my description, I don't know if that's yours. From your June 2011 long-term outlook, you show Medicare doubling as a percentage of GDP over the next 20 years and then rising to 14% of GDP in 2085. By 2037, debt exceeds 200% of GDP. So what we find, and I think everybody agrees with this, I don't need to belabor this, is that Medicare becomes unsustainable under the alternative fiscal scenario because it drives debt to just untenable levels. And so that's a future we know is not going to exist because it simply can't sustain itself. You would agree with that, right?
So I agree that the alternative fiscal scenario can't persist indefinitely. And as you say, you're referring to our projections of the long run from last June.
Right.
I think it's the combination of policies in that scenario that cannot be sustained together. One could sustain the Medicare path while making other changes, or the Social Security path while making other changes, or the revenue path while making other changes. And the set of changes that will be made will depend on you and your colleagues. That combination of policies cannot be sustained over the next quarter century.
So when we look at the extended baseline, my own experience from being on the Medicare Oversight Committee for 12 years now is that whenever we seek to control costs by cutting reimbursement rates to providers, what we learn is that the cuts are either not sustained, meaning they're given back, or they cause higher utilization rates that actually erode the anticipated savings. The President's health care law cut Medicare payments to providers by $500 billion over 10 years to pay for the new entitlement. It also created the IPAB, and under the latest, this proposal that the President has more recently put out, the IPAB will be tasked with holding Medicare's growth rate to GDP plus 0.5% by cutting reimbursements to providers. Now, last year, you testified that CBO has, I think as you said, a gap in the toolkit when it comes to analyzing the behavior of physicians and beneficiaries' ability to access care. Do you still more or less have that gap in the toolkit to try and analyze behavioral changes in access on both the provider and the beneficiary side?
I'm afraid we do, Mr. Chairman. It is a gap that we are trying to fill. We have projects underway. We've been in conversation with members of our panel of health advisors about what evidence we can draw on in trying to give the Congress a better sense of how changes in payments to providers would affect the beneficiaries' access to care and quality of care. But we are at the beginning of that road at this point, not the end.
So I obviously want to encourage you to keep doing that because we're getting an analysis from the actuaries. Rick Foster, the chief actuary at CMS, was here just a few weeks after you were the last time, where he basically told us that he estimates that 40% of providers will become unprofitable by 2050 and therefore go out of business or just stop taking Medicare, according to the cuts under the current health care law. So they're able to make those kinds of projections. He also has told us that Medicare currently pays physicians 80 cents on the dollar, but is on course to pay physicians less than 30 cents on the dollar in decades ahead. He's basically telling us that there are going to be massive access problems and providers are just going to stop taking Medicare beneficiaries. So we're getting this kind of analysis from CMS. I think it would be helpful to get it from CBO. Let me ask you another question about your toolkit. There have been many healthcare economists, both from the left and the right, that have argued that choice and competition actually would lower costs and improve quality. And we've seen some anecdotal evidence of that throughout, even in Medicare areas. A premium support model, which we've talked about here quite a bit. You have bipartisan efforts that have been made. Alice Rivlin, former CBO director and OMB director. My recent work with Senator Ron Wyden, which attempt to employ a competitive bidding process to measure the growth rate of premium support payments. Do you still lack the modeling capabilities to measure the lower costs under such a competitive bidding premium support kind of a system?
We are working very hard to try to fill that gap as well, Mr. Chairman. And the analysis that we did, for example, of your proposal last spring, we were able to incorporate the effect of competition and other factors on the cost of insurance through Medicare or the private sector today. But we did not have the tools to try to analyze how the flexibility that providers, that insurers would have in your proposal or proposals like it, or how the price pressures that people would face under your proposals like it, would affect the dynamic path of spending over time. And that's what we're working to do. And again, we are working with our panel of health advisors, getting their insights as well as our own work. But we are only partway along that road as well.
So here's the point I'm trying to make. The work you do on a long-term budget outlook with respect to Medicare and healthcare spending, because this, as you mentioned, is really healthcare is the big driver of our debt issue in the future. These gaps in the toolkit need to be filled. Look, I know you face serious challenges, but I want to basically get your response to some of the caveats I have so we can better understand how Medicare analysis works today to get a better understanding of what we're really looking at when we get these analyses and where they're lacking. When you compare the impact of proposed Medicare reforms relative to the alternative fiscal scenario, we acknowledge that that scenario is unsustainable. The comparison, therefore, is really not fair or accurate since it's based on a scenario in which the federal government would not have the means to fully fund Medicare benefits to beneficiaries. So we don't want to compare ourselves to some mythical future that we know is unsustainable and will not exist. When you compare Medicare reform options to the extended baseline, we ignore the notion that providers, if they're going to be paid 30 cents on the dollars, aren't going to be continuing to provide benefits. So that scenario is pretty implausible. And we're not capturing a dynamic and a phenomenon that has been advocated by experts on both sides of the aisle, that choice and competition actually work to reduce costs, to tame inflation. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that we are not fully capturing a proper analysis of what reforms actually achieve relative to these two scenarios, which we know are pretty much untenable, or at least we can't even measure the full effects of these two alternative scenarios. Is that pretty accurate?
I certainly think we have not provided you with all the information that we would like to provide to help you and your colleagues understand better the trade-offs that you face. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, but to make sure others understand, over the course of this past year, we've worked desperately hard for a succession of deficit reduction efforts that have been pursued on the Hill. Much of that work involved proposed changes to the health care programs, even though those were not ultimately voted upon. So I have a team of people who've been doing an awful lot of work on a number of proposals, but it has no doubt slowed our work on the ideas that you're discussing. Now, what effects we will find when we finish this work are unclear, I think. There was an exchange recently in the last couple of weeks in the New England Journal of Medicine about premium support plans. Leading health economists wrote for and against. Both the for and against people are members of our panel of health advisors, are among the people that we've consulted. I don't know, and I don't want to prejudge what our findings will be, but I agree, and we all agree at CBO, that we need to push very hard to bring more to bear to give you a fuller sense of the true choices that you face.
And that's basically the point I'm trying to make. Look, we understand that there was a lot of interplay in Congress on all super committees and all of these efforts which tied up the CBO and analysts to do that work instead of trying to improve on the analysis of these kinds of health care reforms. But the problem is where we are is these programs, which are the biggest drivers of our debt in the future, we are measuring any reform effort against two futures that we know, based on at least CMS analysis and outside analysis, are untenable. We know from other analysis that if we pay providers pennies on the dollar, they're just not going to keep providing. And what good is having a program if no provider will actually provide the benefit? And then we also know that if we stick with the status quo, meaning current policy baseline, that our debt gets so out of control that basically we go into a tailspin. So there's got to be another way, and we need to make sure that we have a better analytical toolkit to analyze how best to chart that better way, and we just got our work cut out for us still. And with that, let me turn it to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your testimony, service, and the various studies that you bring to our work.
Thank you.
I think all America would benefit if we were able to return to the prosperity of the Clinton years, contain the short-term deficit as we did when President Clinton was in office, and begin to work together to address these long-term challenges of soaring health care costs. I think we have to do it in a way that is different from what the Chairman recommends, because I believe whatever label you put on it, what is basically a Medicare voucher system simply shifts those health care costs onto vulnerable seniors and individuals with disabilities and does not really resolve the problem. It just shifts the problem from the taxpayer to the seniors. Looking at the issues of how we advance our immediate economic growth, your office put out a study back in November that looked at the impact of the Economic Recovery Act. And while I believe you had a wide range of the effects of that act. All of it was positive, wasn't it? Encouraging economic growth and encouraging job growth?
Yes, we think the effects over the past few years have been certainly positive, and we have a range reflecting the uncertainty in the economics literature.
And that range reflecting the uncertainties of even predicting the past, if you will, that range suggested that growth may have been advanced through the Economic Recovery Act by over 4% in 2010, and again by over 2% in 2011, and that the Economic Recovery Act may well have been largely responsible for creating millions of jobs in this country. Is that right?
Yes, you've identified the high ends of those ranges, Congressman, but you identified those correctly.
And looking at the effects of the Economic Recovery Act and the composition of it, and then trying to understand what that means for policy choices now, again, those policies that would place dollars into the pockets of the families that need them the most right now, for example, extending unemployment compensation. That is the type of policy that will encourage economic growth. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
The same thing would be true of good infrastructure investment in terms of roads and bridges and rail across the country. Those also would be likely to encourage economic growth.
Yes, Congressman, they would.
And on the other extreme, other than building things that taxpayers can see the advantages of and encouraging economic growth, how does it compare to eliminate the inheritance tax, the estate tax, in terms of encouraging economic growth? Does that have much real benefit in encouraging job growth?
So, Congressman, I don't think we've produced estimates of changes in the estate tax directly. We prepared a long testimony for the Senate Budget Committee in the fall that had a chart of this sort that looked at the effects of different sorts of tax and spending policies in boosting economic activity this year and next. On the higher end of the ranges that the policies that seem to have the higher bang for the buck, if you will, are increasing aid to the unemployed and payroll tax reductions for employees or employers. On the lower end of the range are things like broad-based cuts in income taxes, but also on the lower end of the range for the next few years actually is infrastructure spending. That's not because it doesn't matter when it happens, but because it tends to happen rather slowly after the Congress acts because of the planning and contracting process.
Thank you. Oh, we don't have. Oh.
I think I still got another minute.
Okay. My bad. Go ahead.
And specifically, since you mentioned the Senate and the effect of tax changes in the tax rate, I believe that you did a study that was presented in the Senate in 2010 concerning what the effect would be of extending over the next decade the Bush tax cuts. And what did you find would be the effect on economic growth of extending the Bush tax cuts?
So our findings in that testimony, consistent with what I've said today, is that extending those expiring tax cuts for a few years provides a boost to the economy during those few years, but will, by the end of the decade and beyond, be a drag on GDP because the effects of the accumulating debt in crowding out private investment outweigh the beneficial effects of lower tax rates. And that's what we showed in this testimony you're referring to from 2010 in the Senate, and again, consistent with the analysis we presented in this Outlook yesterday.
Exactly. Though it sounds really great in political speeches, the actual effect of extending the Bush tax cuts over the next decade is to reduce economic growth by between 1% and 2%. Isn't that correct, over the decade?
Yes, again, there's a range of estimates depending on precisely what one does and the economic assumptions.
That doesn't include any plus economic growth. All of it is negative in extending those tax cuts.
Right. So in the Outlook we released yesterday, Congressman, I think what you're referring to, when we looked at the effects of the alternative fiscal scenario, which is the tax cuts plus some other things, but the effect of that set of policies is to boost the economy, we think, over the next few years, but by 2022 to reduce GNP by between 1% and 3.7% relative to what would occur under the current law baseline.
And there were a number of things in that alternate baseline that you looked at, other than the negative effects of extending all these tax cuts over the next decade. During the short term, if I understand your testimony to Chairman Ryan, it is that if we reduce the short-term deficit too quickly with sudden reductions in expenditures for vital public services, will actually retard economic growth in the short term.
Yes, I think that's right, Congressman. Reductions in the deficit too quickly through either tax increases or spending reductions would retard the economic recovery. And that is consistent with, I think, the consensus of thinking in the economics profession, consistent with the experience that we're seeing in Europe, where countries that are in worse budget shape than we are and are forced by their inability to borrow to make very drastic changes in policy at a very quickly, are suffering economic consequences from that. When we wrote an issue brief a year or so ago about the risk of a fiscal crisis in the United States, one of the risks that we highlighted was that budget situations tend to deteriorate when economies are already in trouble, and that makes it a particularly bad time to then have to implement these changes very quickly. That emphasizes the importance of Congress acting before we hit a crisis of that sort. But given the low level of current Treasury interest rates, our continued ability to borrow, for now at least, I think many experts believe that although that the changes should not be implemented right away, I want to emphasize that's not an argument against the Congress deciding upon what changes in policy to make. Given the scale of the changes that will be needed relative to current policies, the more warning that people have, and businesses have, that state and local governments have, about what policies will be undertaken, the better it will be. So there is a real cost to waiting to decide upon the courses of action. Once one is decided, then there's a more difficult trade-off about the speed. Waiting too long, of course, has the cost of ending up in a fiscal crisis. Moving too quickly has the cost of slowing the economic recovery.
So pursuing an aggressive austerity program similar to that the conservative government in the United Kingdom has pursued in some of the other European countries is likely to present some of the same type of economic problems for us that it is presenting today to the Europeans.
I think that's right, Congressman. I want to be careful not to second-guess the decisions those governments have made. They face a particular set of circumstances, and I think in some cases had no choice because of inability to borrow money or a fear that they would be unable to borrow money in the very short term. So I'm not suggesting that they've done the wrong thing necessarily. We have not studied their choices carefully enough to speak to that. Just using that as an example of how that sort of very sharp fiscal contraction does weigh on economic activity and jobs in the short run.
And as far as encouraging more jobs, though it's not my preferred policy choice, extending the payroll tax cut is one very positive way of encouraging economic growth.
Yes, we think so, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Keynes. Mr. Garrett.
Oh. One of your heroes. Yeah. Sort of. Might have been a couple.
Yes, I can, Congressman.
So just following up on a couple of points you just raised on this point, with regard to what was done in Europe and the decision-making there, obviously, as you correctly say, we cannot second-guess them. Some of that, and that goes to one of the questions I have, is your presumptions on interest rates. According to your baseline, the American people will be paying about $4.3 trillion in net interest over the next 10 years, based upon, I think it's on page 30 or 31 of the charts and what have you, as interest rates. But obviously, if those interest rates are skewed in a different direction, that number goes up significantly, right?
Yes, Congressman, no doubt.
What's that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And right now, we're at the benefit of the fact that we are the reserve currency of the world, and that is able to keep it down. But we saw what occurred in the private sector, how the spreads changed in 2008 basically overnight for these various companies that initially had very good rates. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And didn't we see the exact same thing that occurred over in Europe with the pigs, with Portugal and Italy and Greece especially, that their interest rates were somewhat favorable before, but basically in an overnight, figuratively overnight period of time, the spreads expanded beyond anyone's projections. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I'm not sure anyone's projection, but certainly in a way that surprised many observers. Yes, I think a significant risk in our projections is that interest rates will rise more rapidly than we have projected. I should say there's risk on the other side, too. Our projection of interest rates lies well above the rates that are implicit in current financial market transactions. When one can essentially back out of the Treasury yield curve the market's predictions of interest rates over the second half of the decade.
They're certainly not above historical averages for the United States. All we have to go back is look at the Carter years, and we would see your rates, those rates off the charts, and that would put this number at a multiple of this $4.3 trillion. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's right.
So within our lifetime, we have seen interest rates in this country dramatically above where they are, and we could, well,
yes, Congressman.
Right again. Which may give, and the final point on this, credence to the argument that whether not overly aggressive contraction, but an aggressive contraction as far as spending might be the prudent direction that this Congress should go in.
Yes, I think, and we've said in other testimonies as well, that there is this trade-off.
Right, I understand that.
And
let me just go back at something. Earlier this past month, last month, bill came out of this committee, 3581, the Budget and Accountability Transparency Act, right? Which, among other things, changes the credit reform methodology. You're familiar with that, I'm sure.
Yes.
Back in June, CBO testified before the committee, quote, by including a market-based risk premium, fair value estimates provide a more comprehensive measure of cost which recognizes that financial risk that the government assumes when it's issuing guarantees is more costly to the taxpayers than FCR estimates suggest. In other words, Fair County suggests, hey, look at that. Do you agree?
Yes, Congressman. We believe that the fair value method of accounting for federal credit transactions provides a more comprehensive measure of their true cost.
Okay. Moving on to another topic that we've had in discussion here, and that's the FHA bailout. You still can hear me, Ken?
I can still hear you.
Good deal. Okay. Very quickly then, on the FHA bailout, there's a possibility, it says, reports out of there, the chances that future net losses on the current outstanding portfolio could exceed current capital resources at close to 50%, which could necessitate a taxpayer bailout for them. Currently, the numbers show that their leveraging ratio is around 400 to 1, which obviously makes everything else we've seen on Wall Street basically pale by comparison. Have you all examined this? Have you examined the budgetary implications if we have to go through, A, a bailout for FHA, and have you looked at that? And B, what would the implications be to the debt limit? And C, a quick answer on that one is, can you give a projection as to the next debt limit increase?
You're correct, Congressman, that the reserves that FHA holds are below the statutory minimum. But there will be no bailout required in the sense that the Congress does not need to take any action to deal with this low level of reserves. If more people default on FHA guaranteed mortgages than FHA has reserves for, then like other federal credit programs, there will be what's called a credit reestimate. There will be an assessment of a higher cost that will be recorded in the budget, but will not require the Congress to take any explicit action. This is the case for all federal credit programs. What it will mean, of course, is that if the FHA doesn't get money back or pays money out that it thought that it wouldn't have to, then that will affect future government borrowing.
So the estimates that we have seen by analysis that we may have to pony up another $50 to $150 billion if that 2% capital level, which is now 0.25 basis points, goes to zero, and they will not have the money actually to make the payments, that we would not actually have to come up with the cash to pay that? Is it correct?
Depends what you mean by whether you have to pony up. What I was saying was that automatically in the budget, without congressional action,
right, it will take
there will be so there's no explicit, there will be no vote about whether to bail out the fund.
But my question was, have you seen what that impact would be on the budget deficit?
Yes, so our baseline projection includes our assessment of what the costs will be for FHA going forward, and I think that is incorporated in the projections that we've shown.
We've got a lot of members here, so with all due respect, we got to try and keep to the time so everybody can get a chance. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor, for the good work that your staff does and your patience with this committee coming before us as we plow some of the same ground. But I think each of your visits, for me, provides greater clarity, and I'm not as grumpy as our chair. I think there's a pretty clear path going forward, which actually is buried in your report, implicit in your testimony, and I think what most of the people here can sort of get their arms around. The chair references the problem we've had in controlling Medicare costs, for example, over time. And it's because we have a flawed payment system more than anything else. And as long as we're going to pay for volume, people will up the volume. And when Congress will, when the heat comes on, dial down what purported to be reforms, and it's a bipartisan failing. Congress is folded, more volume, less value. What we have in the Affordable Care Act, at least, is an outline of things that, if your studies show, if allowed to work over the course of the next 20 years, would have a substantial effect on bending the cost curve. I think we could have a very robust conversation around this table if we focused on how we right-size the military. I think most of us don't think we need troops in Western Europe 65 years after World War II. We can dramatically scale down what's necessary to maintain a nuclear arsenal. Do we need 12 multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers and build another one when nobody else in the world has even one that's comparable to what we've got? And you don't build those things overnight. So we could gear up if some change took place. I mean, I go through the things with the chairman on health care. I mean, not health care, excuse me, agriculture. And actually that was, I thought, a little bright spot in an otherwise mixed bag that was offered up. There's a chance to come together to actually save money. What you buried in your testimony there, I love the line where you talked about the various scenarios going forward, but you talked about one where the deficit scale is up a little bit in the short term, but with balanced policies that deal with refinement and revenue, we can end up having lower deficits in the out year without economic disruption that are predicted with some of the other scenarios that you're talking about. And I would hope that we get to the point where this committee starts zeroing in on areas of agreement that aren't necessarily ideological or partisan, but really point us towards the path that you've outlined. I think it's very, very important. But one thing that I am concerned about is equipping you to be able to help us go through. There was a fascinating article, Ezra Klein's column this morning, where he talked about how much of the deficit is attributed to policies that President Obama signed into law, and how much is attributable to policies that were part of the Bush administration. He comes up with a calculation: $1 billion Obama, $5 billion Bush administration policies. Now, debate more or less what you're talking on this, but this shouldn't be from a columnist in the Washington Post and a couple of think tanks. It'd be great to be able to work in a refined basis with you on things like that going forward. But I wish that you would comment on your capacity to deal with the demands of this committee for more data, more methodology, more ideas that are coming thick and fast, and we want faster turnaround. And the implications of what we do with the data is profound, dealing with trillions of debt and spending in the out year. What's happening to your budget and your ability to respond to this committee?
I appreciate your concern.
And please answer in 30 seconds.
I appreciate your concern for our capacity, Congressman. For certainly the 3 years that I've been at CBO, the demand for work from us has greatly outpaced our ability to supply it, and we feel bad about that all the time. And the chairman referred to some specific cases, but it happens many, many times. I'm on the phone with colleagues of yours apologizing for work we have not been able to get to. On the specific question, yes, our budget is being reduced, I think, along with the budget of the other congressional support agencies and the committee staffs. And from my parochial perspective, that's too bad. But it's not for us to judge that decision of the Congress any more than we judge the other decisions of the Congress.
My time's expired. I appreciate the Chair's patience, but I think that this is one thing that we ought to look at. Cutting their budget 10% when we're throwing more things at them and there is more that relies on what they can produce for us is something that every member of the Budget Committee ought to maybe reflect on, if that's maybe not penny wise and pound foolish.
As you know, that's the jurisdiction of the Appropriations Committee. But thank you. Mr. Campbell.
No, we're so persuasive. I think it would make a difference if we outlined being the budget torch carriers.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Wow. It's like I'm, on concerts, ready to sing. If I do sing, I think I would rather sing like President Obama than Mitt Romney, unfortunately. But there's one of them be better at being president. But that's not what we're here to talk about, and not the same one that's better at singing. Anyway, I don't know whether I'll be as ebullient as Mr. Blumenauer, as grumpy as Mr. Ryan. I will try to be cheerfully realistic. Dr. Elmendorf, good morning. The ranking member in his opening comments talked about and threw out a couple of figures that if all the Bush tax cuts were allowed to expire and the AMT indexed, et cetera, that it would raise about $6.3 trillion using static modeling, which those of us here don't always subscribe to, but $6.3 trillion over the 10 years. And he also said that if it was just the wealthy, which I presume is 250,000 or more, since that's the number the president has thrown out, that would raise about $1 trillion. I don't know whether those numbers are correct, but if they are, and you can tell me if they're roughly in the ballpark, then that means that the over 250,000 account for about 15% or roughly of the total tax potential if you let everything expire over the next 10 years. Is that correct?
I think that's right, Congressman. It's about 20% of the set of tax provisions enacted in 2001 and 2003 and 2009. Then we also show in our tables other expiring tax provisions, including, for example, the research and experimentation tax credit, a set of more standard tax extenders. So I think of the effects of the top tax rates as being about a fifth, based on the latest estimates I've seen from the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, of the set of things often described as the Bush tax cut.
Right. Okay. So if you take all of the different tax things, 15 to 20%, let's say, then if you wanted to get to the alternative scenario and you only raised taxes on 250,000 or more, then you have to take roughly 80 to 85% of the rest of that money and get it out of spending. Is that correct?
If that was, I mean, yes, I think that's right.
Right.
I mean, the alternative fiscal scenario says, what if you don't do these things? And I think what you're saying is that the piece, which is just raising the top tax rates, only makes a small difference in moving the alternative fiscal scenario back toward the current law baseline.
Correct. Thank you. And the reason I bring this up is there's obviously a lot of rhetoric that goes on that somehow we can solve the deficit problem with just that slice of the populace, and we can't. If you want to do that, and then you have to do a lot on the spending side, or you have to increase taxes on virtually everybody to get more towards the alternative scenario. Second thing I'd like to ask about is, and I think I have these numbers correct, but the healthcare law, which we affectionately call Obamacare, the numbers on that were on the basis of some late 2009 CBO projections. And at that time, CBO projected that unemployment would be 4.9% in 2014. Obviously, now I can't, from looking at your thing here, you have 2013 at 9.2%. You have 2014 through 2017 at 5.6. So I clearly in 2014 you project now significantly more unemployment.
8.7%.
Okay, 8.7%. You now project in 2014 versus 4.9% when the Obamacare law was, when the numbers, CBO's numbers scoring the Obamacare law were put into effect. So if we were rescoring that today, based on the scores that you have today, because that's when some of the Medicare increases and the Medicaid and exchange subsidies kick into effect, would not the cost of Obamacare be projected to be significantly larger because of that much higher unemployment figure?
So that piece alone would raise the costs of the Affordable Care Act. I don't know by how much. We were not able, and we say this in the outlook, but I should emphasize, we were not able for this outlook to update those estimates. That's a particularly involved job. We will be doing that as part of our March baseline, which is due out in just a month and a half, we hope. And in the March baseline, you will see new estimates of all of the programs in the budget, but part of that will be new estimates of the cost of the coverage provisions in the Affordable Care Act, and we'll take on board that change in the
right, that and then the Class Act, which you may be dealing with this week, and the fact that that's likely to be pulled back, and that was part of the. All right, thank you very much. I yield back the remaining 3 seconds of my time.
Ms. McClintock, or no, I'm sorry, Ms. Bass is next in line.
Oh, okay, there you go. Yes, it does. Thank you for your testimony this morning. Earlier when we opened, I believe the chair mentioned the need for the president to present solutions instead of just criticizing. And I just wanted to mention that yesterday the president sent his Startup America legislative agenda to accelerate startup and small business growth to Congress. Parts of this agenda have already won bipartisan support in the House, including allowing small businesses to raise capital using social networks and eliminating taxes on capital gains and key investments in small businesses. And I think this is an example of the types of economic stimulus we should be pursuing, and I'm hoping that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will bring the president's package to the House floor for a vote soon. I did want to ask you about states and the fiscal pressure on states, which I do see as a major obstacle to sustainable recovery. At the start of 2012, 29 states have already projected a gap of about $44 billion for fiscal year 2013, and I imagine that this number is going to grow. And given that federal aid was a lifeline for states, and now far from providing assistance to states, I am sure that we will likely be proposing additional cuts. And I wanted to know if you could respond to what toll on the overall economic growth is due to states still facing a long and uncertain recovery.
So, Congresswoman, of course, we don't study state budgets as carefully as we study the federal budget, but state budgets do matter for the overall economic outlook for the economy and for the federal budget outlook as well. And states, as you know, have been through a terribly tough time. Things are a little brighter than they used to be. Revenues have started to grow a little bit in many states. But the overall levels of revenues remain well below what they were in most cases before the recession. Obviously, the experience varies a great deal across states. But in general, revenues remain well below pre-recession levels. And as you've said, the federal support, much provided through the Recovery Act of 2009, this extra federal support, is now waning, and that will put increasing pressure on state budgets. One way in which that matters for the economy is that state and local governments have been reducing their level of employment. So if you look back from the peak of the business cycle before the recession started at the end of 2007, since then, state and local governments have shed about nearly 500,000 workers. And that is part of what has, not a large part, but a non-trivial part of the loss of jobs.
Thank you. Could you also comment about the proposed changes to unemployment insurance, specifically what impact it would have on the economy to reduce the number of weeks that's currently being proposed?
So I'll answer the question sort of a little backward, if I might. Our baseline, our projections that you see, assume current law and thus assume the expiration at the end of this month. However, if the Congress were to extend the emergency unemployment benefits along the same lines that they are currently in place, and that's one of many options, of course, if they were extended along those same lines, that would add maybe about 0.25% to the level of GDP at the end of this year without any other changes in policies. And that would then add maybe about 250,000 jobs by the end of the year.
Thank you very much.
Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this microphone is working. Mr. Elmendorf, we've been hearing a recurrent theme from the other side that the recovery is pretty strong, the economy's getting better, all is well with the world. Let me ask you, are there more people working today or fewer people working today than at the on Inauguration Day of 2009?
I believe the answer to that is there are fewer people, Congressman.
Is the unemployment rate higher or lower than it was on Inauguration Day?
So I don't, to be honest, Congressman, I don't know the unemployment rate on Inauguration Day.
In January 2009, I believe it was 7.8%. Is that higher or lower than it is today?
So the current rate is higher than that rate that you've identified, Congressman.
And if the labor participation rate had remained the same as it was on Inauguration Day, that is, if so many workers didn't get discouraged and leave the workforce, what would the unemployment rate be today?
Let me see if we have an answer to that question. I'm sorry, I don't have that offhand, Congressman.
Would you say it's over 10%?
I just don't know. It's a complicated question. I don't want to speculate.
Is the debt higher or lower today than it was on Inauguration Day?
The debt's higher, Congressman.
How much higher?
Again, Congressman, I have a lot of tables, but they don't really keep track of political events. They keep track mostly of economic events.
Would $4.5 trillion more be in the ballpark?
That may be right. I don't know.
How about the price of a gallon of gasoline, more or less than it was on Inauguration Day?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't know.
Would it be up about 83%, perhaps?
I just don't know.
Let me ask you this. We heard it said, well, we just need to go back to the Clinton prosperity, and I would heartily agree with that. That looks awfully good by today's standards. Did the Clinton administration increase or decrease spending as a percentage of GDP during his 8 years in office?
So I can check. We have these nice tables in the back of our book.
As a percentage of GDP, didn't it decrease under the Clinton administration by a whopping 3.5%?
Yeah, so it depends, of course, how one aligns the fiscal years with the presidencies. Fiscal year 1994, for which the budget was set in 1993, spending was 21% of GDP, and in the year 2000, it was 18.2% of GDP.
So he cut spending relative to GDP.
Well, I guess I would have said that the President and the Congress in that era made a set of decisions that
played out where credit is due. The President signed that legislation. Did he expand or contract the federal government's entitlement obligations during this period?
That's a hard question to answer, Congressman.
I'm referring specifically to the welfare reform that abolished the open-ended welfare system that we had at the time.
Yes, so that was a change. I don't know.
Did he turn in deficits or surpluses during the last 4 years of his administration?
So there were several years of surpluses, Congressman.
Okay, so Clinton reduced spending relative to GDP. He contracted our entitlement obligations. He turned in budget surpluses during his final years in office. Bush, on the other hand, increased spending relative to GDP, expanded our entitlement obligations, and turned in major budget deficits. It seems to me that if increasing spending, increasing our entitlement obligations, and turning in major deficits were the path to prosperity, we should be in the golden age of the American economy right now. Let me ask you this question. How does this recovery track with the Reagan recovery? Senator Phil Gramm has estimated that if the economy tracked under the Obama administration as it did under the Reagan administration, if you recall, Reagan inherited double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, mile-long lines around gas stations, interest rates at 21.5%. Graham estimates that if the economy tracked today as it did under the Reagan years, at this point of the administration, there should be 16 million more Americans working, with per capita income $4,000 higher than it is today. Do you have a comment on that?
No doubt, Congressman, this recovery has been very unusually weak by U.S. historical experience, and we've shown charts like that. I think not in this outlook.
One final quick question, and that is, last year we had a number of experts, including yourselves, warning that we were about 5 years away at best from a sovereign debt crisis. Where are we today?
So I was not one of the people who put a date on that. What we've said consistently is that it's very difficult to predict what set of economic and budgetary circumstances, what set of political dynamics will drive financial markets to stop being willing to lend government money at reasonable interest rates.
Mrs. Castor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. The economy is creating jobs right now. The trends are positive. They're in the right direction. Private sector payrolls added nearly 1.9 million jobs in 2011. The announced unemployment rate in December is 8.5%. That is the lowest in 3 years. We always hear that if the economy can create more jobs, it would lower the deficit. Could you give us a little more detail on that? I know you have a certain projection now. If your projections of the unemployment rate, if we created more jobs, how does that reduce the deficit?
So we actually wrote a letter, which I was looking for but can't find offhand, to Congressman Van Hollen a few months ago that talked about the effects of a stronger economy on the budget. And the largest part of the widening of budget deficits over the past few years has been the weakness of the economy. The explicit actions of the government, the Recovery Act and other things, have also led to wider deficits. But the largest part of the widening has been the automatic changes, particularly in revenues, but also on the, and to some extent on the spending side, to a weak economy, less taxable income, more people out of work. And those things have had a big effect on the budget. And a very important part of the narrowing that we see in the budget deficit over the next few years under current law is improvement in the economy. There's also, of course, a very large part, which is the changes in policies scheduled to take effect under current law. But the economy matters a great deal. We show in an appendix in this outlook a rule of thumb for how stronger or weaker economic growth would affect budget outcomes.
Is there a precise number if the unemployment rate is reduced, say, by 0.2, the exact impact that has on cutting the deficit?
Well, there certainly isn't a precise number in my head. Whether we could estimate a number for you, I think we probably could. I did find the letter we wrote to Congressman Van Hollen. This was actually October 4th of last year. In this experiment, I think we looked at the effects of moving the economy all the way back to its potential level. But we could certainly look, Congresswoman, at what the effects of a particular change in the unemployment rate might be.
Because this is the great frustration, that over the last year, the Congress really has the ability to do some things. For example, the transportation bill that is long overdue, I know you said there's a lag there, but what if we had gotten it done a year ago? What if we had some short-term investment in some jobs initiatives? We know, the President laid out in the American Jobs Act, people at home love the idea of repairing schools, putting people to work there. We've got so many bridges in the state of Florida, schools that are in need of repair, and it would just seem that's a great common sense solution that would put people back to work and help us reduce the deficit.
So I have found the answer to your specific question, actually, which is, and this was in the letter to Congressman Van Hollen, we estimate that a 1 percentage point reduction in the unemployment rate would reduce the deficit by about 0.5% of GDP, using some average historical relationships.
Great. Thank you very much. On another topic, colleagues, we really should all be working together to try to find a solution on a permanent Medicare doc fix. And I know one proposal that is being considered is looking at the savings. President Obama now has ended the war in Iraq with the support of the American people, and there are savings in the overseas contingency funds. That's the fund where I guess CBO has said we're going to anticipate that we're going to stay in Iraq longer. What is available in the OCO for us to use to possibly developing a permanent fix so that our parents and grandparents can maintain their relationship with the doctor of their choice?
So let me try to explain this issue of the overseas contingency operations funding and how it appears in our projections. I think is a technical and complicated one. Let me try to explain for everyone. There isn't an OCO fund in the sense of a set of money which is sitting somewhere. What our baseline does do is for discretionary spending that is not capped by the Budget Control Act, and this OCO funding is not capped by the Budget Control Act. For that sort of funding, we project we take the latest level of appropriations provided by Congress, and we extrapolate that with increases for inflation over time. And that extrapolation from the latest funding that Congress has provided for those purposes amounts to about $1.4 trillion over the coming decade. But that is just our extrapolation based on the latest actions of the Congress. And how the Congress might want to think about that money with relationship to other things that Congress wants to do is really up to you all.
Which is all borrowed money.
Well, there's a lot of tax revenue. There's a lot more spending than tax revenue. We're borrowing a lot for some purpose, Congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Stutzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elmendorf, for being here today. And I really appreciate your testimony today, and I think we would all be wise to take your report and act upon it. I'd like to touch on two things. I'd like to touch on the tax rates and then also on Social Security a little bit. Could you give us, and maybe you touched on this a little bit, and maybe I missed it, but could you touch on what effect, if we allowed if Congress would raise taxes at the end of this year, outside of the payroll tax rates, what kind of effect would that have on the economy immediately?
So if Congress did nothing, so the tax rates automatically increased going into next year, then we've shown an estimate in the outlook for the effects of that and other policies together. But I can give you an estimate for the effects of the tax piece alone. If the expiring let me be clear about what experiment I have in mind here. In the current law baseline, taxes go up and spending is cut, particularly because of the Budget Control Act. If instead, and our economic forecast is conditioned on that, if instead the Congress extended the expiring tax provisions for the next few years, then that would increase the level of GDP at the end of 2013 by between 0.3% and 2.5%. By our estimates. That's about 2/3 of the total effects of this alternative fiscal scenario that we show in the outlook. The other third is the effects of relaxing the spending cuts that we include in this scenario.
So would you recommend that Congress extend the current tax rates for 3 to 5 years to boost the economy and then revisit the issue once the economy has started to progress?
It's not our place, Congressman, to make recommendations, but we have tried to illustrate here in the analysis we did and in the comments I've made the short-term negative economic consequences of fiscal contraction that is very rapid. Of course, as you understand, as we've talked about, there are long-term very negative economic consequences of our not having fiscal restraint relative to the current policies in place.
But I think the facts are pretty clear that if we don't, if we would raise taxes, if taxes were to be raised at the end of this year, that could be a detriment to the current state of our economy. Is that correct?
We think that the increases in tax rates built into current law for the end of this year will reduce economic activity and employment next year relative to what would occur if those tax rate increases were deferred.
I want to touch on the payroll tax rates currently. Your estimate of the deficit does not include any costs associated with extending the payroll holiday. What is the cost of extending the payroll holiday through the end of this year, and what would be the deficit that would be added to that cost?
So if the payroll tax, the lower payroll tax rate were extended through the end of this calendar year, we estimate that would add $75 billion to the fiscal year 2012 deficit and $25 billion to the fiscal year 2013 deficit. Of course, that's just because fiscal year 2013 starts in the last quarter of this calendar year. So the total is about $100 billion.
So what does that do to Social Security? How many years are we shortening the life of Social Security if we continue the current rates?
Well, it has no direct effect on the Social Security Trust Fund. It depends, of course, how you do it. But the way what's happened in these lower payroll tax rates so far is that general revenue has been transferred to the Social Security Trust Fund in the amount of the foregone payroll tax receipts. So the trust fund has been held harmless in the lower payroll tax rate. And if you extended the lower payroll tax rate with the same provision as is in place now, then the trust fund will continue to be held harmless. If you didn't do that, then the trust fund would be $100 billion to the worse by the end of the year relative to what would happen under current law. I don't know what effect that has on the expiration date of the trust fund. The trust fund has trillions of dollars. We think the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund, that part of Social Security, has decades before it will be exhausted.
Did you look at what kind of effect, if the payroll tax rates were not to be extended at the current levels, what kind of effect would that have on the economy?
Well, extending...
If we let Americans keep more of their money in their pocket, does that have any effect on the economy, positive or negative?
Yes, so relative to current law, extending the payroll tax cut through the end of the year will increase output and increase employment by the end of the year.
Okay.
I mean, in general, lower taxes or higher spending in the short term, given an economy with so many unused resources, those actions will tend to provide a boost in the short term. The amount of the boost depends on the specifics of the policy, and the testimonies that we've done, including the one last fall, we've tried to lay out what we estimate to be the relative bang for the buck of different sorts of policies. But the directions are pretty consistent. But the crucial point to remember is that that works for a few years in an economy with unemployed resources. Because the constraint in economic activity now is really the demand for goods and services. By later in the decade, the constraint on our economic activity will be the supply of savings. It will be the labor supply. It will be productivity. And in that sort of world, what matters, the way the budget choices matter is importantly through the amount of borrowing the government does, also through the effects of tax rates on people's behavior, and through the effect of certain spending programs on productivity and so on.
Thank you.
Mr. Pasquarello.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a sharp increase in military spending in 1943. Guess why? So when you take numbers out of context and game the numbers, I think we all have a responsibility here to set the record clear. We have an entirely different situation.
May I just ask, gentlemen, who's doing what? Who are you addressing this to?
Gentleman from California who just took off.
Well, the gentleman's not here, so
Well, I will
not
reduce my remarks about it, if that's okay with you. We had a very different situation in terms of President Bush I when he lowered taxes. And Mr. Clinton raised taxes. So if you want to put numbers in context and why things were better at one time and not so good at another time, we need all the facts. Both of those presidents worked hard to do what was necessary at the particular time in history when they took office. This president took office in January of 2009 And you know what the employment and unemployment was in the 2 months before him, and in the 2 years before him, and in the 2 months after he raised his hand, and in the 2 years after he raised his hand. So I want to show you a chart, if I may. We're gaming the numbers. The blue line in this chart shows the rate at which state and local government have been growing or shrinking as compared to real GDP since the late 80s. Very clear. Even I understand it, so you all should understand it. But those are the numbers. You didn't put them there, and I didn't put them there. These are the numbers. In 2007, if you look, try to look closely, the private sector and government were growing. Then the economy began to shrink and then fell off the cliff during the financial crisis, which occurred at the end of 2008. Can I see the second chart, please? Thank you. This chart shows the rate of government investments, or how we are sacrificing the future as well as the present. At the beginning of 2009, in the face of political timidity and outright obstructionism, we acted to stem the drop in economic growth and unemployment, and we passed the Recovery Act, February of 2009. The most successful parts of the Recovery Act were state fiscal relief that went directly into state and local jobs. The result was the blue line's upward spike in 2009. Then we all know the rest of the story. The private sector, 2009 recovery stalled, and everything started to drop in the second quarter of 2010. The President proposed the American Jobs Act, which included $35 billion to reverse this trend, but it stalled in the Congress. We lose teachers, we lose police, and we lose firefighters. Now we've lost close to 700,000 in the public sector. So one is going up and the other is going down dramatically. And last night, so we could put a human touch on this, Mr. Elmendorf, police officer Kevin Brennan in Brooklyn was shot down, shot in the face, pursuing an individual with an illegal gun. We have reduced in human factors, when we talk about, glibly talking about what we can cut and what we can't cut. I mean, the direction we're going, we're going to have to cut money to the FBI, transportation, border security, vets benefits, because that's where we're heading. Because there are people here that want to destroy the government, that it has no responsibility, and it can't live up to the obligations. Now, my question to you is this. In your opinion, was the effect of the elimination of thousands of public sector jobs, teachers, police, and firefighters, in overall economic growth to the economy?
No, Congressman. I think
Why not?
The loss of public sector jobs is, as I said earlier, a part of the overall loss of jobs that we've seen in this very prolonged and severe economic downturn.
And we've been seeing that sector shrink.
Time. Let's let him finish answering.
I said we've seen that sector of the job market shrink.
Yes, Congressman.
Mr. Flores.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Elmendorf, for joining us today. Start out with a caveat to begin with. Economic growth is virtually the same as employment growth, right? I mean, if we talk about economic growth, we could talk about more people working.
They certainly move together, obviously not perfectly. But
not perfectly, but pretty good correlation. So my question starts with this, and I'd like to keep the answers fairly short. Which economic activity provides greater economic growth and employment? Option A is private investment, or option B is federal spending?
Congressman, it depends on the nature of the federal spending you have in mind.
Well, I have a chart. I don't have it with me right now, but private investment is the correct answer. Private investment trumps federal spending almost every time. Which policy option provides greater economic growth? Leaving $1 in the hands of a taxpayer, or taking that dollar from that taxpayer and increasing federal spending?
Depends on the nature of the federal spending, Congressman. I'm afraid I'm not trying to be difficult, but it does matter what money is used for.
Okay. Let's put it this way then. What would create more jobs, Keystone XL Pipeline or Solyndra? We spent about $500 million on Solyndra. How many jobs do we have from that?
So, Congressman, we have not studied those particular examples.
Not very many, though, right?
Companies that fail generally don't create a lot of jobs. Depends
Right.
what they do along the way,
Right.
of course. And I have not tried to study the history of that firm or...
And how many federal dollars is it going to take to build the Keystone XL Pipeline?
I don't know, Congressman.
0. And the estimates vary widely. Some people say 20,000 temporary jobs. Some people say it's in just in the thousands. It doesn't make any difference. On one hand, option A is Solyndra, where we spent $500 million taxpayer dollars and got no jobs. On the other hand, we have $7 billion of private investment, and we get good long-term economic job growth out of it, right?
Certainly, a shortfall in private investment in the past few years has been a drag on the economy during the past few years and will continue to be a drag on the economy over the decade. Part of the reason we say in our report that we've marked down the projection of GDP at the end of the decade relative to what we would have had without the financial crisis and recession is a shortfall in investment.
That takes us to my next question. What is, in your opinion, or in your agency's analysis, what is the optimum level of these activities as a percentage of GDP, tax revenues? What is the optimum level at which you have good economic growth? You're not raising the deficit too high to cause long-term damage, but at the same time you're taxing at an appropriate level to fund the government. What percentage of GDP is that?
I don't think there is an analytic answer to that question, Congressman. It's a matter of people's choices. Deciding the level of taxes that one thinks is appropriate can't really be done separately from deciding the level of spending that one thinks is appropriate.
Well, that's my next question. So what's optimal? I mean, one of the things you've talked about here is the rub that we have between, on one hand, you've said that the increase in tax rates that we're going to have on January 1st of next year is going to dampen economic activity, and it's going to have a pretty big dampening impact on economic activity. On the other hand, you said that the deficits, which really deficits are just transfer payments they represent government spending in excess of revenues, so you could call it a giant stimulus bill if you wanted to. If you have $1 trillion of deficits, it's really $1 trillion of government stimulus. You said that those deficits are going to, or that spending, that stimulus is going to ramp up economic activity, or if we turn that spending down, it's going to lower economic activity. So what I'm trying to get to is, what's the optimum percentage of tax revenues versus spending? I mean, in the real world, they ought to be the same, and I'm just trying to get a figure for what that should be.
Well,
again, as a percentage of GDP.
They certainly can't be too far apart for too long.
Right.
So the thing that can't happen is that the ratio of our debt to our GDP rises indefinitely. That can't occur because at some point, that we can't really predict when, but at some point, people will stop lending that government money.
Correct. Let's go to the next one. What was the cost per job created under the stimulus spending, under the ARRA?
I'm sorry, Congressman. I don't have an answer to that offhand. We can take the estimate we have of the changes in employment and divide that by the $837 billion, but I don't know offhand what the answer to that would be.
Okay. Well, it's substantial. It's a lot more than private dollar investment, or the number of jobs you get for a private investment dollar spent. Lastly, you noted that in your report that the cost of the stimulus has increased from $821 billion to $839 billion. What's behind that cost increase?
I think we made some small revisions to the cost of some of the refundable tax credits enacted in that legislation, and maybe on the unemployment insurance side as well. Just the refundable, I'm told, some revision of the refundable tax credit.
I guess the bottom line is the cost of the stimulus plan is still going up. We don't have many jobs from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Spider. Mr. Honda.
There it goes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back.
Thank you, Congressman.
I enjoyed our last discussion, and I congratulate your daughters coming to watch you work.
Thank you.
I'm sure they're going to learn something here. one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years in being in this budget committee is that your job is to be neutral in your responses. It's to respond in ways that are objective and honest in terms of, and not be shaded by some of the way we would like to lead our questions, and have some sort of a response that appears to be favorable or unfavorable. So I appreciate the difficulty of your task, and I'm awed at your grasp of of the information that you have, having to respond to the different folks here. Having said that,
now you're going to stump me. You set me up.
No, I'm trying to just reflect my thinking in that, the kinds of things that we're trying to struggle with here in the Budget Committee on behalf of the country. But I think every member of Congress agrees that we do have a deficit and a debt problem that deserves our serious attention. And the attention should be looked at in terms of the dynamics of what's happened in the past, what could happen in the future, but how we put together the different policies and the mixture of it so that we try to figure out what's the best outcome in the future. We only disagree, I guess, about the best way to how to solve it, and hope that we can really take a balanced approach and use a mix of the many tools that are at our disposals. So in your initial gut reaction to a plan that has these kinds of characteristics, what would be your reaction to having a plan that balances the budget by 2021, makes it targeted investments in areas like infrastructure and education, and then finances these changes with a progressive tax code, and also ending our overseas military engagements? What would be your gut reaction to a plan that has those kinds of elements in it?
Well, Congressman, I mean, we can and do analyze the economic effects of particular sorts of policies that Congress is considering. We've done quite a bit of this, for example, in terms of different tax policies that we've talked a little about today. We've also written about the value of certain sorts of government investments in physical capital of a sort, traditional sorts of highways and other infrastructure, but also in what economists call human capital, the skills of workers. That's harder to quantify, though. So we can talk about specific choices of that sort. We have not been asked to analyze the effects of an overarching fiscal plan, except to the extent that we do an analysis every year of the President's budget, both the direct budgetary effects and the economic effects. And we've done an analysis in this outlook of this particular alternative scenario, which is not good in the long run. We haven't looked at what you're talking about exactly, and we have to know exactly what it was. But also I want to emphasize that this is not just the reason that CBO doesn't make policy recommendations is because the policy choices are not just a matter of analysis. It's a matter ultimately of value judgments by you and your colleagues on behalf of me and my fellow citizens about what we want the government to do and not to do. And I think the lesson of this alternative fiscal scenario and the size of the gap in 2022 and the fact that relative to the historical pattern, what we see there is so striking is the rise in the cost of Social Security and the health care programs. The ultimate question will be whether we want to make, as a country, substantial cutbacks in Social Security and the federal health care programs relative to how they're scheduled to work now, or substantial increases in tax revenue relative to that historical experience. We have to pick at least one. We can do a combination of those two. We can't do neither. We cannot sustain the traditional levels of tax revenue and the current benefits we provide for Americans when they become older. At the same time, given the rising number of older Americans and the rising cost of health care. So any proposal that, that is set on one side of that or the other has implications for the other side, and it's up to you and your colleagues to weigh those, and we can provide some analysis that I hope is helpful, but ultimately it is a matter of value judgments.
Thank you. And I guess in algebra it means X equals whatever your value system is. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Elmendorf. I'm going to move away from the policy and get down into the weeds on some of the numbers if I can. If I could get that first slide up, that would be great. Probably something that's just of interest to you and me, but let's take 5 minutes and go over some detail. I was looking at the report last night and noticed something fairly interesting regarding the inflation numbers, and it's something that you and I have talked about before. I've talked about with Dr. Bernanke, a bunch of different folks. And to run through the quick history, in your forecast of last year, you all expected inflation, and we're talking about the CPI now for urban workers. We'd pick any measure you want, but we use them across this same analysis. And you thought it would be 1.3%. Then in August, you adjusted that up to an assumption of 2.8, and then we finished the year at about 3.3. At the same time that we saw in actual rates of inflation that were higher than your estimates, you didn't change the assumptions for 2012, roughly the same, 1.3 last January, 1.3 again in August, and 1.4 in the report from yesterday. And that grabbed my attention, and it led me to the next slide, which I want to ask you about, which is that we took a look at your projections for CPIU for the next 5-year windows, the first 5-year window and the second 5-year window. They're slightly different, off by a year because of their rolling number, but let's call it the first-year window and the 5-year window. And you have, despite the fact that inflation turned out to be considerably higher last year than you expected, you actually revised down your expectations for inflation over the course of the first 5-year window and left it the same for the second 5-year window. And what we did, Mr. Elmendorf, was went in and looked at the historical data from the BLS since 1970 and took a series of 5-year rolling averages. And it turns out you are using an assumption for the first 5-year window in this report that would be the lowest 5-year rolling average in recorded history. And I'm just wondering how you can justify that. If you take a look at what we've got, the average 5-year rolling average, which I know sounds strange, but I think you see where I'm going, over the last 40 years is almost 4.5%. The average 5-year rolling average over the last 10 years is 2.5%. The lowest we could find of any 5-year rolling average going back to 1970 was actually 2006 through 2010, and that was still 2.2%, 2.18. And the worst, as Mr. Garrett referenced earlier in his questioning, was 1977 through 1981, when the average was above 10%. What is the justification in taking these unprecedented rates of inflation as your assumption as you look into the future?
So I haven't looked at those precise numbers, but I understand your point, I think, Congressman. And you're certainly correct that our forecasts of inflation have errors in them, like our forecasts of all other economic variables. In terms of last year, there were some particular developments in energy markets and other parts of the economy that pushed inflation above what we and many people had been expecting. And a number of people thought at the time that those were likely to be transitory developments. And the way the data are unfolding is so far consistent with that story. So the change in the CPIU over the past 3 months is less than it was over the past 6 months, which is less than it was over the past 12 months. So the latest information about inflation suggests that it is, in fact, coming down. Now, more broadly, I mentioned 2 things. One is that relative to years preceding the early 1980s, there's been a fundamental change in the behavior of central banks in this country and around the world, related to a fundamental change in economist understanding of the role of central banks in keeping inflation down. And so as we look out to the second half of the decade, I think it's very clear that the Federal Reserve's objective is to keep inflation around 2%, and we think they have the tools to do that. For the next few years, I think the crucial thing to realize is that we have a period of unprecedentedly prolonged high unemployment since the Depression. So we're living through a period that is the longest period of excess workers and houses and so on in the economy that we've had in my lifetime. And there's a systematic relationship.
And I recognize that I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm running out of time, and I may have to finish this in a second round. But I understand the relationship between GDP growth and the fact there's excess capacity in the labor markets, and that would allow us to grow the economy without seeing a lot of inflation. But you all have actually, and this is the next slide, you all have actually revised up your GDP estimates over the course of the first 5-year window, from 3.4% when we did this last January to 4.1% today, which again is it's well above the historical average and approaching the highest ever actual performance within the GDP growth in a 5-year window. So I guess my question is, how is it that you are assuming historic rates of growth and historically low rates of inflation?
So the 15-second answer, Mr. Chairman, if I might, is that we're starting that growth from a particularly large gap between our actual output and the potential output of the economy. I'm happy to take this up with you additionally, Congressman, later.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Moore's gone. Mr. Yarmouth's gone. Let's go with Ms. McCollum. All right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, good to have you here. And I have 2 questions. They're rather brief, and so I will give them to you together. Many Americans get up and go to work every day. More of them would like to be able to get up and go to work today, but Americans get up and go to work every day. They work hard and they contribute to the success of our country. For every dollar of income from wages, these working Americans, they land up quite often paying as much as double the tax rate. Double the tax rate of investors receiving income from dividends or capital gains. So to me, this hardly seems fair. Since there's such a significant tax benefit, even a bias, I would say, extended to investors over working Americans, is there some equitable, qualifiable benefit to the economy and job creation inherited in every dollar investors receive from dividends or capital gains versus the dollar that's earned in wages? So what's the impact of the federal deficit and this tax inequity and the benefits provided to investors over workers? My second question kind of goes back to, I'd like you to kind of summarize the different options because people have asked you a lot of questions. So you have some scenarios that you can talk about that you've presented to us. Again, all the Bush tax cuts are allowed to expire at the end of 2012. What is the effect on the economy and the federal deficit? If only the upper end Bush tax and income earners over $1 million are allowed to expire, or if all the Bush tax cuts were extended for the next 10 years, what is the effect on the economy? What is the effect on the federal deficit? But if you just kind of, I've been struggling with this, you know, a worker earns $1 versus an investor who gets a benefit.
Well, so Congresswoman, as you know, in setting tax rates, Congress takes a number of considerations into account. The equity issues are part of that. So is the effect on the economy. And the economic effects are not necessarily correlated with what you or others might view as the justice of the situation. So those are really sort of separate issues, and I'm not qualified to speak to the equity issues, except in my own personal role. When we do analysis of the effects of changes in tax rates, higher tax rates generally discourage the thing that's being taxed. Higher tax rates on work, on balance, reduce work effort. Higher tax rates on the return to saving, on balance, reduces the amount of saving. And we incorporate those effects in the estimates that we do. So I don't think there's a right answer from an economics perspective of what the relative tax rates should be, because it is this combination of both economic effects and value judgments again. We can do work about the effects of changes in particular sorts of taxes, as can our colleagues in the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation for you. But I don't have comparisons of different sorts of things to use here. On the second question you asked, the economic effects of extending all of the expiring tax provisions would be a little larger than the economic effects of extending all the expiring tax provisions except for the top tax rates. So in the short term, the lower the taxes are in general and the higher spending is in general, that tends to boost the economy, as I've said. Now, in the analysis we've done before, we've said that the effects of the lowering the top tax rates is smaller on the economy in the short term than the effects of changes in tax rates further down the income distribution, because higher income people tend to spend a smaller share of the money that they have, and what the economy needs in the short term is more spending. So the effects of extending the expiring tax rates at the top will be smaller dollar for dollar in the short term in stimulating the economy than the effects of extending the other tax cuts. In the longer term, it's more complicated because in the longer term, what matters importantly, as I've said, is not the demand for spending. It really is the supply of saving and the supply of the work effort and so on. And in the longer run, it's more complicated actually to look at the effects of different sorts of changes in the tax rates. And we have some examples of this in the testimony I did for the Senate Budget Committee. I think it was a year and a half ago or so. And we can talk with you more about that. But it's more subtle in the longer term.
Thank you. Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here today. I want to turn our attention back to a subject that's been mentioned several times in the previous questions, but about trust funds, but more specifically about Social Security. And in understanding trust funds, I think you've done a good job in the introduction to this particular section, and I want to lift up one paragraph that's in there on page 121 when you say a trust fund receives cash receipts that are not needed immediately to pay benefits or cover other costs. The Treasury uses the extra income to reduce the amount of new federal borrowing that is necessary to finance the government-wide deficit. And the reverse happens when revenues for a trust fund fall short of the expenses in a given year. So I think that helps us to understand a little bit more about how the trust fund works. And then I want to turn everyone's attention to page 122. And there, just above the Social Security Trust Fund statement or section, you say, without legislative action, that there are 3 trust funds are projected to be exhausted during that period, and that period you're talking about is 2013 to 2022. Social Security Disabilities, Insurance Trust Fund, Medicare Hospital Trust Fund, and the Highway Trust Fund. Now, looking at Social Security Trust Fund, we know that it is running a cash deficit, and payments are going out for benefits that exceed the Social Security payroll taxes that are coming in. And, of course, if this trend were to continue, we would need to redeem the Social Security Trust Fund's assets to make payments. Do the Social Security Trust Funds represent real assets that government can draw upon?
So as we say, Congresswoman, in the paragraph following the one you read, the balance in a trust fund is an asset for the individual program, but a liability for the rest of the government. And the resources to redeem a trust fund securities in some future year must be generated through taxes, income from other government sources, or borrowing from the public in that year. Therefore, trust funds have an important legal meaning in that their balances are a measure of the amounts the government has the legal authority to spend for certain purposes, but they have little relevance in an economic or budgetary sense.
So if we then, let's say, because you say on page 124, by 2022, the trust fund for the old age and survivors insurance is projected to show a deficit. What then? What then do we do? Do we go into the securities? Are there actual securities there that can be redeemed to pay for the benefits?
Well, there are actual securities there. The trust fund is the legal owner of a very large pile of honest-to-God government securities. But the resources to honor those has to come from some other place, as we've discussed. So when the trust fund starts to give securities back to the government, the rest of the government, and ask for cash, that cash has to come from somewhere, some source in that year.
And again, help me understand where they come from. You mentioned borrowing.
Basic sources of funds to the government on a unified basis all the time is the revenue that's collected, through taxes or fees or something else, and borrowing.
So at the end of the day, it almost is a shell game where we just move this money around, and it appears that in trying to understand when we tell people they're paying a tax, a payroll tax, and at the other end they expect a benefit, the dollars really that are being put in there aren't necessarily the dollars that at the end of the day are going to be redeemed, because there's a lot of shifting and moving of the money.
I mean, I think how much people get out depends on the decisions of the Congress about future benefits. As you know, in CBO's work, we focus very much on the unified federal budget. Trust funds are, the Social Security Trust Fund and others are accounting mechanisms, and they have a useful role, I think, as accounting mechanisms. But in our analysis of the budget situation and our projections of the future budget, we focus on the outlays for programs and the collection of money without focusing on which particular account something is being kept track of in. We do talk about the trust funds in this appendix that you've read, but we think a more useful way for you and your colleagues to think about the fiscal policy choices is not through the trust fund lens as much as in terms of the overall activities of the government in both providing benefits and services and in collecting revenue.
But I think to make the point here, and I know my time is up, but I think to make the point here is that at the end of the day, the money's got to come from somewhere. And the money, if it starts to run out, has got to come from somewhere, and i.e., many times that's borrowing more money and increasing our deficit.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all that you do for us, and welcome to your family who's here.
Thank you.
So how many jobs do you guys estimate the stimulus bill created?
So our estimate is that it has a path over time. Our estimate is that in 2010, for example, that it added between 0.7 and 3.3 million people to the work employment. In 2011, that it added between 0.5 and 2.6 million people in employment. For 2012, those numbers are smaller because the budgetary effects of the Recovery Act are waning.
The money's coming out of the economy, or not going into the economy.
Not going into the economy.
Right.
Yes.
And so what was the change? So we have CBO telling us that the stimulus bill has created millions of jobs here officially on the record. What was the change in GDP growth from, say, that January and February prior to the stimulus bill? We know we were bleeding 700,000 jobs a month. What was the change in GDP growth, say, from that January and February to now, for example?
Well, so as you know, GDP was falling very sharply at the beginning of 2009, and it reached its trough around the middle of the year.
Which was?
What economists call that the end of the recession, which is just because recession is a technical term that means the declining period of GDP, when GDP is declining. And since then, GDP has been growing.
By how many points? From the bottom in that summer to the growth we saw in the last quarter, the swing.
So I'm sorry, I don't know that offhand.
I mean, would it grow last quarter, 2.8?
Yes, so the GDP
what was it in that summer?
2.8%.
The negative?
I don't remember what it was in the first half of that, in either of the quarters of 2000.
So we've had significant change. We've had jobs created. And so one of my colleagues said earlier, you know, what's better, private investment, and private investment trumps federal spending. And I don't think there's anybody here who would not rather have the private sector coming in, making investments, creating jobs. That's what we're all, you know, trying to figure out how to make that happen, and what environment needs to be in place in order to make that happen, from deficits to investments that we make. But the issue really at that point was that there wasn't private investment, correct? In that.
Yes, I think there was a very sharp reduction in household spending on the consumer goods, in housing construction, in business investment, and as private demand faltered, part of what happened in response to that was an automatic change in the government budget. Tax revenues fall when income falls, and spending rises when incomes are down. But also then the government acted through the Recovery Act and other measures, and we think that the Recovery Act provided some additional demand, some from government purchases, but some by lowering taxes in a way that boosted private demand.
Did you run any models on what the world would have looked like had we not passed a stimulus package? At that point, you guys had to be saying, "Wow, this is it could." If you do a stimulus package, it's $800 billion. If you do one that's $1.5 billion or $1.5 trillion, or if you do nothing, what was the model looking like of the do nothing scenario?
So we did estimates in the winter of 2009 of the effects of the versions of the Recovery Act as they were being considered. And I think we published a chart at some point that showed a decline in the level of GDP that was very severe in the absence of the Recovery Act, and a decline that was still severe but not as severe in the presence of the Recovery Act.
So
it's the estimates. I mean, in a sense, one can take our estimates that we publish now of the effects of the Recovery Act and subtract off those effects from the realized GDP growth and employment levels to get a sense of what we think would have happened in the absence of the Recovery Act.
Okay, great. I just want to make that point. I mean, no one here is happy with where we're at today. Believe me, I represent Youngstown, Ohio. We have the poorest city in the country. No one's happy with where we are at. But I think it's important for us to say, wait a minute, there was no private investment. This had some significant effect. CBO is telling us millions of jobs, turnaround in GDP growth. Last quick question. So now we're debating these value judgments of putting taxes, raising taxes on hedge funds, billionaires, millionaires, whatever, versus federal spending. What increases the GDP more significantly? A tax cut for a millionaire or higher versus a federal investment in, say, building roads and bridges and fixing the combined sewer overflow problem we have in the country?
Over the next few years, Congressman, we think that higher income people spend a small share of the incremental income or wealth they have from a tax cut. Doesn't provide very much stimulus to the economy relative to giving money to people who will spend a larger share of that money. And that includes sending money out in the form of infrastructure investment. The big issue in that case, as I mentioned before, is the delay from your actions to the money actually flowing.
Thank you. Mr. Ribble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple slides. I wonder if we can get those brought up. Dr. Elmendorf, thanks for being here. I know it's been a long morning already. I appreciate your patience. You've been kind with your time. I want to take a look at two slides very briefly and then just kind of get you to comment on them. This one shows consumer spending dating back to 2001. We can see the recession period in there, the drop-off at consumer spending, but even that drop-off, it dropped off just back to about 2007 levels, which was at the end of the housing boom, one of the largest growth periods in the nation's economy, and then subsequently it's turned around and began to grow again. And I guess the thing that pops in my mind is, we hear a lot about consumer spending. If consumer spending is the ticket to job growth, and consumer spending is up, and up fairly dramatically from 2007, I wonder why we don't have jobs.
So it's the sum of the demands for goods and services that drive overall employment. So it's adding up what's happening in consumer spending and business investment and housing investment and the government's, federal and state and local government's purchases of goods and services and net export.
Good. Good. Let me just bring another slide up. I'm going to take along the same line.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go ahead. I'll let you continue. I've got one more slide if we can bring that up. All right. We've talked a lot, and my colleague, Mr. Ryan from Ohio, just mentioned it. You just mentioned your comment about private investment. You know, now I know that you're an economist, but I'm going to ask you to put on your psychology hat. And can you possibly tell me, because I spent 30 years in the private sector running my own business, creating jobs in this country. I know that the political class here in Washington likes to claim they claim jobs. Democrats claimed all these jobs, and Republicans, we create all these jobs. I find it a little insulting. I thought I actually helped create them myself in my company. But private investment is way off. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, investment is one of the more cyclically sensitive parts of the economy. So in general, business investment falls sharply in recessions and then rebounds sharply in recoveries. But it is true that in this particular downturn, business investment fell to an especially low level. We show a picture of that ourselves in our outlook, I think. And there are a number of factors here, and it's hard to disentangle them. We're actually doing some work now trying to disentangle various factors that have led to the slow recovery. And when that work is finished, we'll, of course, supply it to you and others.
Let me tell you what small business owners and job creators are telling me back in my home district. They're telling me that they have absolutely no confidence that the political class in Washington, D.C. can solve these problems. And until they have a sense that we can solve the problems, until they have a sense that Democrats and Republicans can lay down their swords, maybe put aside preconceived impressions of reality. I have to defend this type of economic model. They have to defend their type of economic model. We're going to hold on to it till we die. Business isn't going to invest money because they don't trust us. And I would call on all my colleagues to just lay down the sword and try to fix this thing and inject some confidence back in the economy. Because I will tell you, the other thing I hear from them is that the government has gotten too much in the way. They feel that a $16 trillion debt, it scares the living daylights out of them. They feel that a regulatory environment that places thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and new rules on them every single year is a burden on them. And they feel that oppressive tax rates that continue to take from them money that they could use to create more and more jobs is a risk to them. And I hear this over and over again, not from just one or two. And I'm going to close with one other comment and one other question. I'm really pleased to see that you brought your daughters with you today. I wish my own two children were here with me today and my grandchildren were here today. You've done a wonderful job. I'm sure they're very proud of you. Do you think that their future...
Pretty sure they're bored by now, Congressman.
That could be. Sorry, ladies. He's doing a good job. But do you feel that your children's future is brighter today than it was $4 trillion of debt ago?
A lot has happened in the country since our debt was $4 trillion smaller, Congressman, and I think some aspects of that have been good for their future and some not, but that's a personal judgment in any case. On the matter of business investment, I'm not at all surprised that the uncertainty about future government policies is weighing on businesses. There's a recent paper actually co-written by a member of our panel of economic advisors that shows that uncertainty about government policies is especially high now, and given the temporary nature of so many parts of the tax code, such lack of clarity about what will happen in healthcare policy and financial regulatory policy and so on, we think that is weighing on business investment decisions. But I would just say quickly that I think the surveys of businesses suggest that the biggest factor weighing on their hiring and investing is uncertainty about the future demand for their products. And that is a sort of circular exercise, which is that if some businesses spent more and hired more, that would bolster the demand for other businesses' work, and that would have a virtuous circle. But I think the biggest source of uncertainty that businesses face is what their sales.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And I will tell you that regulations and taxes are affecting that demand. Thank you.
Mr. Huelskamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, I appreciate your time today. I was looking through the report, and on page 36 actually discuss participation in the labor force. And you note the employment rate in the fourth quarter of 2011 would have been about 1.25 percentage points higher than the actual rate of 8.7%. So trying to understand this, so when you factor in the number of people who quit looking for work, our effective unemployment rate is really closer at to 10%?
Yes, I guess that's right. I can't find the I'm sorry, I can't find a specific place, but yes. I mean, I think it is often the case in downturns that some people who lose jobs keep looking and some stop looking at least for a while. But I think that effect has been particularly pronounced in this downturn. Of course, the rise in unemployment and the duration of high unemployment has been particularly pronounced as well.
Yeah, it's been very difficult. But again, 10% effective unemployment rate, that still doesn't factor in the underemployed. That's correct. That doesn't include those.
I think that's right.
Okay. If we factor those in, what percentage do we have of unemployed or underemployed?
I'm sorry, I don't have that. I think that's an important concept, Congressman. I just don't have those numbers at hand.
Yeah, it certainly is in particular area, so I appreciate that and a follow-up on that. Other questions, turning to taxes, you've got two scenarios. But if I do the back of the envelope estimate is that if Congress does nothing, we foresee at least a $5 trillion tax increase. If the Bush-Obama tax cuts of 01, 03, and 2010 all expires, that about a $5 trillion over that 10-year window?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Okay, and the net economic impact of a $5 trillion tax increase would be positive, negative?
Well, in the short run, we think that tax increase would have a negative effect on the economy. By the end of the decade, we think that tax increase, scheduled in current law, would have a positive effect on the economy. And the reason is because the increase in tax rates embodied in current law has opposing effects on GDP over the medium term and long term. The lower tax rates do encourage additional work effort and saving in a way that we capture in our models and that are good for the economy, but the tremendous amount of extra borrowing crowds out government debt, crowds out private investment, and that's bad for the economy. And in our modeling, using a range of assumptions, the effects of the extra debt dominates the effects of the lower tax rates by the end of the decade.
Even in light of, in the latter part of your comment about crowding other investment, you would say that even in light of Mr. Bernanke's statement, we're going to have massively low borrowing cost for the foreseeable future. I mean, doesn't that play a significant role in trying to predict what would occur? And that's a question I'll ask Mr. Bernanke hopefully in the next day or so.
Yes, so I'm curious to hear his answer. Certainly the low borrowing cost is part of what we have in our baseline projections. But it still may be the case, and we think it would be the case, that relative to what would happen with a debt that was this big, having a debt of this big, will raise interest rates. So that increase was coming from a lower baseline level and has often been the case. But we think that extra demand for credit will still push up the cost of credit.
And another question, I appreciate that. I ask my staff regularly when they think the next debt limit increase will be needed, and they've been saying it'll be kind of March. But with the new higher deficit figures, another $1 trillion for the fourth year in a row, just unbelievable. What's your latest estimate of when the federal government will run out of money without using extraordinary means like is continually discussed?
So we don't try to track Treasury's cash flows on a monthly basis. So we're not the people to come to for a specific prediction at any point of when a date might be.
Well, I would say going to the Treasury for a specific prediction would be problematic as well. On the day they said they'd run out of cash on August 2nd, they actually had another 10 days worth of resources. So I appreciate that. But just big picture, will we get to 2013 or will we run out of money before a new president takes office?
So under current law, we think that yes, the government can get to 2013 without raising the debt ceiling or going to the extraordinary measures that you mentioned. But that is quite uncertain. It depends on our economic projection. It also depends, of course, on the actions that Congress takes.
Okay. I appreciate it. And lastly, one quick question. Last summer we had an exchange about which government programs created economic growth. Went back and forth with your office. I know that's difficult to pull out. And looking at the an effective unemployment rate of 10%, and the anemic economic projections, is it fair to say the tremendous run-up in government spending of 2009 did not benefit the economy in the long run?
The extra government spending from the Recovery Act in 2009 boosted the economy in the short term, but we believe, yes, unless there are offsetting changes made that pay off the extra debt that was incurred, the economy will be worse off as a result by the time we get back to potential output and full employment later in the decade.
Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome. Thank you for being here. You and I always seem to talk about this time in the day. Part of being a new member that has a last name that begins with the letter R.
Too, if you want, but I'm happy to be here.
I heard your testimony with the chairman when you had a discussion about unsustainability, and I heard you to say it's not Medicare, and I want to clear this up because this was my impression. It's not Medicare that's causing the unsustainability. We have a mix of policies that need to be worked on.
Yes, I said what made the alternative fiscal scenario unsustainable in the long run is the combination of policies. It is the growth, certainly, of Medicare, other federal health programs, and Social Security.
So I just want to
set against taxes that remain close to their historical average share.
So I want to be clear, for the record, for my own understanding, for the American people, that you are not saying that we don't have to reform Medicare, or are you? If we were to adjust all the other parts of that mix and not touch Medicare, is this country okay in the long run?
Well, so in our projections from last summer for 2035, we have Medicare being about 2% of GDP larger than it is today. So that alone can be accommodated through other changes in policy. I don't think Medicare has to be changed over the next 25 years that we focus on here, but something has to be changed from current policies. And there are, I mean, again, I'm not recommending that we leave it alone.
So seniors going on Medicare now might use it for the next 25 years, so I need a longer-term view than that. I want to talk about my 2-year-old, my 4-year-old. I want to talk about their kids.
Well, gentlemen, yield for a second. So just looking at the CBO's long-term budget outlook, to answer your question, because we have it right here, Medicare, Medicaid, the health care entitlements plus the interest on debt at that time will equal federal revenues. That means no other program in the federal government outside of the health care programs and the interest on the debt will be paid for by any revenues in 2034.
That's right, but as you know, the debt service that we're paying at that point arises from the combination of policies we've had in the intervening years. So again, I think it is a judgment that you all need to make about whether you want to have a country with historical levels of revenues and changes in Social Security and Medicare programs to come down to that level, or the programs as they're currently structured and increases in revenues to come up to that level, or some combination.
I just think when you're talking about a program.
No, go ahead.
I just think when you're talking about a program that is going to be 14% of GDP and has no interest in plateauing from there, it's going to keep going and going on. You have got to, if you're going to have an honest discussion with us and the American people, understand that this is part of the centerpiece, perhaps, of the problem.
Again, Congressman, I think I've been very clear here and many other times that it is the aging of the population and the rising cost of health care that is putting this unbelievable pressure on the federal budget. But there are different ways to respond to that, and it's not our place to endorse or...
Yeah, but I understand that. You said that a few times, too. But when you say mix of current policies, you're endorsing something. You are saying, and that's what I want to be clear about, that Medicare reform is part of this mix and that it has to be reformed, or not. So that's what I want to get to.
Right. So I don't think that one can say that any single piece has to be reformed. It is the combination of policies.
All right. Well, that's on record. All right.
Can't be pursued.
Let me go here. When Ms. Kasher was asking you some questions about growing out of this deficit, I want to be clear for the record that you mean to say that we can have policies that create growth, whatever we agree them to be, that can help reduce the deficit. That has nothing to do with reducing the debt. By definition, if you don't wipe out the deficit year to year, you can't start attacking the debt. So you cannot grow your way out of the debt we're in and the debt that's coming down the road alone. You cannot grow, just by growing the economy, all the dials not touched, you cannot grow your way out of this debt.
So in a
first world mature economy.
In our baseline, our current law projections, debt continues to rise because we continue to have deficits, as you're saying. It falls slowly relative to GDP because the debt is rising more slowly than GDP by the second half of the decade under these current law projections.
But if you're not eliminating the deficit, you are not reducing the debt.
You're not reducing the dollar value of the debt.
So growth alone will not do this. Regarding the extended payroll tax cut, I understood that the cost of the tax cut, if extended this year, will be about $100 billion. And you indicated that is better for the near-term economy than the Bush tax cuts? Or
that dollar for dollar. That we estimate that a payroll tax, lower payroll taxes has a stronger stimulative effect than a broad-based.
And you also would agree then that $100 billion has to be paid for by future generations?
Yes, since we're already on.
For our near-term economic bump, other future generations need to pay for that.
Well, or this generation a few years later, but yes, it has to be paid for by somebody.
Right.
Yes.
With the small amount of time I have left, John Maynard Keynes, what do you believe he got right, and what do you believe what don't you subscribe to?
I think it is a widespread view among macroeconomists today that over the medium or long run, economies are what we would call classical or neoclassical, so that the constraint on output and incomes is the supply of the factors of production, labor supply, saving, and so on. But also, I think, a view of most economists who are thinking about business cycles is that in the short term, then a very important determinant of the level of output and the level of employment is the demand for goods and services. And that is, at its heart, a Keynesian idea, the actual models we use, the way this is structured, has evolved a tremendous amount in the 75 years since
Evolves a
Keynes
good word
about
for it.
that. But that view that in the short run, the economy has what people think of as Keynesian properties, and the medium and long run, it doesn't have those Keynesian properties. That's, I think, a consensus view that you'll find in leading textbooks. Not everybody shares it, I don't want to say that, but I think it is a consensus view that you'll find in leading textbooks and a lot of the writings of people over the past few years, with a range of political views and a range of views about whether the right way to proceed in the country is to change taxes or spending and so on.
And my time's expired. Thank you. And I will call the office from time to time.
Please do.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for staying with us throughout the morning. Just so you know, I tremendously appreciate the work you and your team does. I know we're here to talk about your latest body of work, but I want to talk a little bit about a publication you all do every so often, the Historical Effective Federal Tax Rates. Just love this publication. And as I turn to your most recent edition, I see this, that if you're in the bottom 40% of income earners in this country, you actually profit from the American income tax system. That almost half this country, I'm not talking about the refund check you get in April, I'm talking about the tax code, the tax collection system in this country sends you more money than you send to it. The privilege of being an American citizen is profitable through the income tax code for the bottom 40% of all Americans. I don't think we think about that. We all think that we're paying our fair share, that somebody else needs to pay a share. You know, I'm a proponent of the fair tax. It's H.R. 25 here in the House. It abolishes the entire income tax code. And I look to your report that tells me that for 40% of Americans, the income tax does not collect taxes. It distributes largesse. As evidence, the income tax code has lost its way. Also look at your trends in federal tax revenues and tax rates. Love that publication as well. And what I see, particularly when I combine it with figure 4.1 from your economic outlook today, I look back during the Carter years, the Ford years, the 1970s, where the highest ordinary income rate in this country was 70%. The income tax rate was 70% in this country. But I look at your CBO baseline of revenues, and I see that revenues during those times were right there at historical averages, maybe a little lower. I fast forward to 1986 and the income tax reforms that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan put into place. I see the lowest ordinary individual income tax rates on record. But then I go to your figure 4.1, again, the CBO baseline, and I find out that during those years, revenues were a little higher than the average revenues. So the higher tax rates lead to lower revenues, and the lower tax rates correspond to higher revenues. And as a freshman, I appreciate you being able to educate me in that way. What's really got me confused, though, is going back to figure 4.1, I see you have a CBO baseline projection and an alternative fiscal scenario. And the alternative fiscal scenario assumes that the President Bush's tax cuts, President Obama's tax cuts, all of those tax cuts stay in place. Is that correct?
That all the expiring tax provisions are extended with the exception of the payroll tax.
So according to what I see here in figure 4.1, if we leave every single tax cut in place, in fact, if we even bring back the tax cuts that expired in 2011, revenues will still be higher than the 50-year historical norm. We leave every tax cut in place, federal revenues will be higher in this 10-year window than the 50-year norm. Am I reading that chart correctly?
By the end of the decade, they would be higher than the average of the previous 50 years. Yes. That's right, Congressman.
But I've heard my colleagues talk about that revenue is an important component of our deficit crisis, and that the deficit is caused by these tax cuts. So I go to your CBO baseline proposal that assumes all of these tax cuts expire. And what I see is that if we allow these tax cuts to expire, federal revenues as a percent of GDP will rise to the highest levels in 50 years. Is that right? I mean, I only see a 50-year window here. It's the highest level on the chart. Is that correct?
It's the highest on the chart. I can't speak to the longer history offhand.
So if we allow those tax cuts to expire and we allow federal revenues to rise to the highest level in 50 years, are we able to start paying down debt?
If the tax cuts expire as under current law, and you keep to current law in spending, then the debt continues to rise.
So the highest tax rates over the last 50 years don't pay down any debt, but do they eliminate our annual deficits?
No. Again, if you keep if the rest of current law remains in place, then we continue and this is our current law baseline.
So if
those continued deficits.
If we allow all the tax cuts to expire, if we allow federal revenues to rise to the highest level in the last 50 years, we don't pay down a penny in debt. We don't eliminate our national deficit, and we continue to accumulate that. What that tells me, Dr. Elmendorf, is that clearly revenues are not the challenge in this scenario. It's spending that's the problem. And I know that the folks back home are wondering, when we allow revenues to rise to their highest levels in 50 years, what they're getting for that money.
But the short answer to that, Congressman, is that there will be far more people collecting Social Security checks in 2022 than any point in the past 50 years. There will be far more people collecting Medicare benefits in 2022 than in the preceding 50 years. More elderly people collecting benefits for long-term care through Medicaid than the preceding 50 years. So the American people are receiving benefits. Whether you and they view those benefits as worth that cost is a judgment that you and they have to make.
Well, I guess that goes to my colleague, Mr. Akita's point. If we can allow revenues to rise to the highest level in 50 years and that still doesn't solve the problem, we better focus on the spending side of the ledger. I appreciate you bringing that to us today, and thank you again for spending so much time with us.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Let me just conclude by just going to the outstanding work you do in your summer long-term budget outlook, which is the June budget outlook. And I just want to simply impress upon the point that I think members here are trying to make, which we tried at the beginning of the hearing. In 2034, using your numbers, spending on our entitlement health care programs plus interest exceeds all federal revenues in 2034. In the end of the century, 2085, Medicare goes from where it is now approximately 3% of GDP to 14% of GDP. All health care entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and the exchange subsidies, just those programs right there exceed our revenue trend. So before the end of the century, before our kids and our grandkids are raising their families, all federal revenue that comes into the government won't be enough to cover our health care entitlements. And so sure, I know you can't give us policy recommendations, or you don't give us policy recommendations or value judgments. It is obvious from your numbers that this path is unsustainable. I mean, we can't just be a government that only provides health care benefits. We have national defense. We have education concerns. We have environmental concerns. We have Social Security. And so the sooner we recognize that the path we are on is ruinous, which is what you're showing us in these long-term numbers, the tax rates you tell us that we need to have if we want to finance this through income taxes, the bottom tax bracket's 25%, the middle income tax bracket's 66%, the top tax rate's 88%, we won't have an economy. Your own model breaks down, I think, in 2027 because of debt burdens. So I think we need to be a little more candid about the absolute unsustainability of it, and it isn't simply a question of cutting back a little bit here on discretionary spending or trimming this program over here. This is all so unsustainable. It's the fault of both political parties, and the sooner we recognize that, the better off we're going to be, not only in keeping commitment to people who've organized their lives around these programs, but for our economy as well, and that's the point we're trying to make.
So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, you're fonder of our very long-term projections than we are. When we talk with our panel of health advisors about for their guidance in setting the very long-term projections, they don't really even talk with us about it. They think it's a silly question to ask. So we do provide them out the full 75 years, as the Social Security Medicare actuaries do. We do the same thing for our long-term Social Security and Medicare projections. But if you look back 75 years ago and picture what people in 1935 would have done in trying to project health spending in 2010, you can see why that's a very perilous business. So we try to focus, as we have in this long-term budget outlook, on the next 25 years. What I think there is an absolute trade-off between putting revenues above their historical average share of GDP and cutting Social Security and the federal health care programs in some...
Are they being cut in real terms in what we're talking about, or are rates of growth going down?
Cut relative to, I should be careful, cut relative to what will occur under current law. And we've said this, as you know, time and time again, that the Congress will need to either raise revenues well above what's been the historical average share of GDP, or make fundamental changes in the large entitlement programs, or some combination. And even if one reaches for a combination, the changes to both revenues and these large entitlement programs will each need to be large because the scale of the problem, the gap between the revenues we're used to sending to the government and the benefits that we're used to getting from the government is getting so large.
And the largest one are the health care entitlements, correct?
The fastest growing programs are the health care entitlements. So Medicare is a little smaller than Social Security, even 25 years from now, but Medicare and Medicaid together are larger than Social Security by the end of the, well, I think today, and this is over the rest of the decade.
And this is why the point I tried to make earlier about getting better data and research and analytical tools on ideas and reforms on bending the cost growth of health care is really crucial. Because if we can get at the root cause of health inflation, that is one of the smartest, best things we can do to deal with this situation. Because I think, as you've shown in your analysis, the kinds of tax rates that this country would have to absorb would be growth destroying if we actually went down that path. So.
And as you know, that work is a very high priority for us.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just have a closing comment also.
Okay. I'll get the last word, you know.
Well, you're the chair. There's a couple of comments I made that I just needed to just respond to in terms of highest income in the past 50 years, or expenditures that we see on the chart. The charts are kind of static in this, that we have to take them in the context of other dynamics. I think this is what I think we're trying to be impressed upon by Dr. Elmendorf. In terms of the highest income or highest expenditure in the last 50 years, 50 years ago, I was probably making around $200 a month take home. And today, 50 years later, I have the highest income that I could ever have imagined or ever dreamed of. But it's because of the way the economy has changed, the cost of living has changed and things like that. So to compare today, yesterday from today, has to be taken in context of a lot of information. And so in terms of numbers and budget and projections and things like that, the science and the art, if you will, of budgeting and trying to make the right decisions for the future and for our country has to be a thoughtful process through dialogue and debate. And I think that's why I appreciate today's session. And Mr. Chairman, you may have the last word.
Okay. No, I'm just having fun with you, but I actually will. It's a technical question I've been asked to ask you for the record. According to the March 2011 baseline, limiting spending to gas tax levels would result in spending that would be an average of $13 billion per year below current levels. Has that changed under the new baseline?
So that number, I think, is one I'm not familiar with, but I can give you, I think, the current number.
Okay.
We estimate, I think this is the answer to your question, which I was helpfully provided with late last night.
That's, I think, why we're asked to ask you this right now.
Over the coming decade, we estimate that on average, annual outlays from the highway account or the highway trust fund will be about $8 billion more than revenue and interest credited to the account. Although, of course, that gap varies by year over the coming decade.
So that's the change from last year's baseline to this year's baseline?
No, that's just...
No, what's the delta?
Just now. Well, I don't have a number for last year, so I don't know what it used to be. What I know is what it is now.
Okay.
In our current projection, the gap between this, on average, over the coming decade, between the outlays and the revenues is $8 billion per year.
Okay. All right. I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all.
The hearing is adjourned.
Well, we'll have more on the economy tomorrow when Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke